Well, hello. Could I get a thumbs up if my audio is working? Thank you so much. So my name is Drew Lanthram. I'm teacher monitor for ASE, and welcome to the Computer Science and Technology panel. Thank you to our three panelists for being here today. In a few minutes, we will hear from each panelist about their educational and professional journey toward the current position. After all three have told their story, we'll have a question and answer session. Please save your questions until then. When it's time for questions, please type your questions in the chat and get ready by turning on your video and your microphone. If you're not comfortable with your video, you can leave it off, but please remember that we're trying to get you out of your comfort zone and help you grow by doing that. I'll monitor the order of the questions that come in the chat, and we'll call on people to ask the questions. When you're called on, please unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. And we're going to hear from our speakers in this order: Amber Horvath, Dr. Christoph Tuscher, and Catherine O'Connell. And panelists, please remember to highlight any lessons that you've learned along your journey. But keep your story to under 10 minutes, and let's get started. First off is Amber Horvath, and she is a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, studying how to help developers better keep track of and disseminate programming-related information through in-context notes. Prior to joining Carnegie Mellon, she was an undergraduate researcher at Oregon State University, working with Dr. Margaret Burnett, who she met through the ASE program. So thank you, Amber, and I will let you go ahead and share about yourself.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Yes, so my name is Amber Horvath, and I am a PhD student, as you just learned. So I'll briefly go through my journey. I learned about the ASE program through my high school research science class. And prior to joining ASE, I didn't even really know that I wanted to be involved in computer science or technology. I looked through all of the different projects, and I chose one of the projects as one of my top 5 selections, which was to work with Dr. Margaret Burnett, because the project sounded kind of interesting. I hadn't really heard about human-computer interaction, or this concept of like helping developers or designing systems to better facilitate usage of computers. So I chose her project, and over the course of the summer, I had such a good time. Like, I remember coming to one of these sessions as well, like many moons ago, and it was a lot of fun to see all the cool projects that were going on around the state of Oregon. And through that summer internship experience, I just gained this familiarity that with research and technology, and realized that this was something that I thought was really interesting and cool. So I remember at the end of the summer, Margaret asked me what I was planning to do, since it was between my junior and senior year of high school, what I was planning to do once I graduated high school. And I was like, oh, I don't know, like maybe I'll go and like be an English major. And she was like, that's cool, but if you are interested, like I would love to have you as an undergraduate researcher. And I was like, oh yeah, like I could see myself continuing to do this as well. And so I came on to Oregon State as a computer science major, and I was a little worried at first because I didn't have a lot of programming experience, but through like the mentorship that I had with Margaret and her master's and PhD students, I was able to get really into programming and working in a lab setting at the same time, and continued my coursework. Working with Margaret also opened a lot of doors. That's actually how I got introduced to Carnegie Mellon University. Was one of her colleagues that she's done research with is now the professor that I work with here, Dr. Brad Myers. And so between my junior and senior year of undergrad, I did an internship out here in Pittsburgh, and I was like, oh, this is a lot of fun. Like, what a cool city. And yeah, it was a lot of fun, I guess, just getting to work in a lab environment and develop tools and help masters and PhD students complete studies. And now I get to do that work for myself and get to drive my own research path, which is definitely a unique experience. I also got to get a taste of industry. So I did an internship at Intel up in Hillsborough for around half a year, doing UX or user experience design and prototyping and testing. So I have experience in industry as well. And so that was another big kind of turning point in my career, was towards the end of my undergraduate career, just making the decision as to whether I wanted to continue in industry or to go into academia. And ultimately, I decided that academia spoke to me a bit more, just because I really valued being able to work on projects that I found interesting and drive my own path, essentially, in terms of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. So there's a lot of freedom and flexibility that is really special in that space. I also just wanted to kind of give back, I guess. Like, working with Margaret, she like opened so many doors for me and is such an influential figure. And in computing, like, I found it to be really valuable to have like women mentors. And so I want to be a woman mentor to other young people that kind of need that guidance, especially as they're getting into STEM. So I am happy to be here now as a PhD student. I'm getting towards the end of my journey as a PhD student. So I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what the next step is, whether it be actually going back to industry as a researcher, since that is like a space that I also have some experience with. I did an internship at Google back a couple of years ago, and they have some really cool research programs, and then, or go back into academia and serve as a professor and continue this trend of giving back through mentorship. So I think that was like a very brief overview. Yeah, if you have any questions related to PhD student life, applying to grad school, even just whether or not to consider it, like it is a big choice, I am happy to answer any of those questions.
Well, thank you, Amber, very much for sharing. And our next speaker is Dr. Christoph Teuscher. And Dr. Christoph Teuscher is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Portland State and an ASE mentor. Professor Teuscher's research goal is to develop disruptive new computing paradigms and machines that will allow for lasting breakthroughs and open new application domains in the next 5 to 20 years. His team uses an interdisciplinary approach and applies tools from computer science, computer engineering, physics, biology, complex system science, and cognitive science to the study and the design of next-generation computing models and architectures. Dr. Teuscher obtained his Master's of Science and PhD degree in computer science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne in 2000 and 2004, respectively. In 2004, he became a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, San Diego. In 2005, a Distinguished Director's Postdoctoral Fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and in 2007, a technical staff member. So welcome, Dr. Teuscher, and I'll give it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. All right, let me back up a couple of decades and tell you a little bit about my story. which was very non-linear and very non-traditional, I would say. I think I'm here as a professor in the electrical and computer engineering department because I had great mentors and I had great opportunities and people believed in me in many ways throughout my career. So I grew up in Switzerland. I got my went to school there, mandatory school and after school, regular school. I did an apprenticeship as an electronics engineer. That is a 4-year education. Apprenticeships are very common in Switzerland. Not everybody goes to college. We don't really have that here in the US, that opportunity. Apprenticeships are really applied. You work in a company, you get a great education that is very applied, and they usually hire you right away. So I did that as an electronics engineer, and I really enjoyed that. As part of that apprenticeship, I participated in the Swiss contest for young scientists and built a wind measuring computer and was really passionate about these things at that point. And was also selected to compete in the European community contest for young scientists, and that sort of like was my first step into another world I really didn't know about. And after finishing my apprenticeship, I decided that this was not something I wanted to continue, and I decided to go to college. And I got a bit of a shortcut because I already had an apprenticeship, so I didn't have to do the full college terms. That was a totally new experience. And for example, I learned that I was really absolutely terrible in French. I could not speak a word in French, and it was horrible. I could not understand anything. And I thought, well, after college, I'd probably go back to industry. But I decided to go and get a master's in computer science. And I was looking at two schools specifically. One was ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, which is in the German-speaking part, and I also considered the French-speaking part. And I decided to go to the French-speaking part and sort of tame the beast of my French problems that I had in college. And to my surprise, I learned speaking French to perfection quite quickly. And I really was surprised by that because I struggled so many years in school with French and just couldn't get it to work. And it was not the way I was, I guess, learning languages. Anyway, I learned French. I got my master's in computer science. And one summer, my advisor back then asked me, well, Christoph, do you have any plans? And I said, no, I don't really have plans. And he said, well, I have this research opportunity for you. Do you want to work in my lab over the summer? And that was really the beginning of an intense career switch or unexpected career switch. I really didn't know what research was at this point. I had no idea what a PhD was or anything like that. I had no master plan for my life, except that I thought, well, I would eventually go back to industry. So I started working in this lab over the summer and built some electronic circuits and platforms that I didn't know anything about initially. It was really, an adventure in many ways. Anyway, at the end of the summer, I ended up publishing a paper. They sent me to the US. It was my first trip to the United States to a conference where I presented my results. And I was like, oh my God, I was blown away by this world that I didn't know about at all. And so sooner than later, I signed up for a PhD program at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. Again, the French-speaking part. By then, I was very, 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 very good with French. I could really write and understand everything. And I got a PhD in computer science from that same institution in 3 years, which is that's the usual time in Europe. PhDs are rather quick there, not unlike in the US where it tends to take more like 5 or 6 years typically. anyway, so that, yeah, it was very unexpected. And again, it was because I had great mentors. I had folks supporting me with my crazy ideas and believing in me, and especially my PhD advisor was just amazing. He had such great visions and supported my own visions. And he probably knew that I was like, going to get hit dead ends and whatnot. And anyway, he let me go and figure things out. And that was a great experience. After that, well, I had an opportunity to go to San Diego as a postdoc. Did a couple of years there at Los Alamos, and eventually decided to become a faculty at Portland State. Again, this was never really on my map. I didn't really know what a professor would do, what sort of things you would do, but I discovered these opportunities on the way without having a master plan, and became a faculty. And I've been here since 2008 at Portland State, and part of me giving back to interns is offering internships, and I've been doing that for the last 12 or 13 years. It's a great way to give back to interns the things that I was benefiting from and had opportunities from. And so that really is a sort of a leitmotif through my career. I think opportunities, great mentors, influential figures that helped me to be successful. Research really, to me, is this sort of like amazing endeavor to get into no man's lands and discover new things and push the limits. And it's also about failure, right? Almost all the things you will do in research will be through failure. So you have to be really, really frustration tolerant, I think, because almost all the things I do are rejections, failures, and struggles. And that is absolutely part of research, right? If it would easy, it wouldn't be research. And so you just have to live with that. And I think that's almost, a lifestyle. If you're a researcher, that's just part of your daily business. I think what I really enjoy in academia is the freedom. I don't know of any job where you have the freedom and the job security and all the cool things you can do. I do technically not have a boss. Right. I mean, that's quite unique. I can do whatever I want as long as I can get funding for these things. I don't think any other job really has that, as far as I can tell. Anyway, so yeah, lessons learned, look for opportunities. Don't lock into a 10 or 5-year plan of your life and you want to be there, you want to have a house, you want to have kids and all these things. There's so much more that you can discover by jumping on great opportunities, learning new things, and work with your peers and your mentors, because that's the folks who really can help you to be successful and get you to the next step. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about careers, grad school, whatever you want to ask.
Well, thank you, Dr. Torscher, very much. And our next speaker is Catherine O'Connor, and she is a business systems developer for Extensus. And Catherine has been a data analyst since graduating from a bachelor's in computer science and anthropology in 2016. She's worked both in the healthcare and software industries and obtained a master's in library and information science in 2020. She's passionate about the intersection between humanity and technology. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I've got one of those names that looks like it's complicated, but it just sounds like O'Connell. The spelling is just fun. So no worries, nobody would know that. It's Irish. So yes, I feel like I'm going to echo some of what the previous panelists have said, especially around things like self-doubt and failure. because I definitely grew up with this mentality that you kind of have to be perfect for everything to work out. And that is just not how life works. So a little bit of background on me. I grew up in a Portland suburb, and I definitely had some advantages that made it easier for me to get into computer science. So I had a computer in the home from a very young age. I was encouraged to learn things about it and to make mistakes on it. And so I pretty early on, I had like a working knowledge of how computers worked. But interestingly, I did not consider computer science as a career until a teacher in high school was like, you're really good at this, right? Like you could actually do this. And a lot of that was because I didn't have a whole lot of role models, a whole lot of women role models. I didn't see women programming. I didn't really understand that that's something you could professionally do. And especially like there was still, I don't know how much it is today, but there was still very much this sort of genius mentality when it came to computer science. And if you didn't fit like a very specific image of what a genius was, then, well, you're probably just not going to be very good at it. Which is not true, by the way, but I didn't know this at the time. So, I got to the end of high school and was like, well, computer science sounds pretty interesting, but I was interested in a lot of things. I've never fit into categories particularly well. And so I knew I was going to go off to college, but I didn't really quite have a field picked out. And then calamity struck in my life. And without getting super personal about the details, I suddenly found myself going from this suburb and all of these resources. And I had to get out of a situation and go out to the Oregon coast, which is very rural and very isolated. And there's, nobody like me out there for sure. And so I ended up kind of stuck out there for the next 12 years. And really, it hit home that I only had a high school diploma and I had no work history. So I had to start at the bottom, and I worked in retail. I worked in fast food. Realized pretty quickly I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to find a way to get an education, even though I'm way out here away from universities. Online school was becoming more of a thing, fortunately for me. So I was able to go to community college and do the 2-year thing and then transfer over to Oregon State University. And I do want to highlight that I could tell this, like I was working multiple jobs all through university. And I could tell this story in a way that makes it sound like I worked really hard and like, look how much it paid off. Yes, I worked hard, but if you have perfectionist tendencies like I do, it is possible to work too hard. And I did way too much. I double majored because I still couldn't choose what I wanted to do. I double majored in computer science and anthropology. And to make ends meet, I had to work multiple jobs and my grades suffered for it. And there are classes that I don't even remember because I was just trying to make ends meet. And it was a little rough. So I had to learn that it's okay to go back and relearn things. And it doesn't, even if you failed and like didn't do as well in a class as you wanted to, like that material is still going to be there and you can still come back to it later when you're in a better spot. So when I graduated, or when I was about to graduate, I was approached by a recruiter at Google who said, hey, saw your coursework, am interested in your skill set, would love you to interview for a developer role. And this to me was the dream, I'm working 3 jobs and barely making it. And suddenly, I'm being offered this opportunity where I know I could make a lot of money. And so, I studied all of everything I could find about Google. I tried to make sure I had all of my knowledge together. And then I bombed the coding interview. I don't show well on tests. I never have. I failed lots and lots of math tests as a kid and people didn't really think I was advanced in it. And then suddenly I'm in a statistical field, go figure. And so I was just devastated. I was not used to failing at things. And that was a big one for me. And I didn't know really what else to do because remote work wasn't as big of a thing at the time. And so I was just kind of stuck with whatever was available in my area since Google was now off the table. And so I was able to get a job working at my county's mental health department as a data analyst. And even though it wasn't the sort of developer coding role that I wanted, there was code involved in it. And I just sort of dove in and said, let's make the most of this and find out, what it's all about. And it turns out that I have an aptitude for it. And I loved taking a bunch of chaotic numbers and making them make sense and telling a story out of them. I still wanted to be a developer at that point, but living where I was, there were no resources. I had no mentors. I was the only one in the company who even knew code. Like it was very isolating. And so I did the best that I could, but eventually was just like, you know what, I don't want to do this forever. I really want to try to make this leap again and see if I can do it now that I'm a bit older and have some more security. So I ended up going to grad school to get the master's in library and information science. And the reason I chose that rather than like a hard CS degree is, again, because I don't quite fit totally in that box. And I had seen that there seemed to be a little bit more like social science and a little bit more humanities paired with technology in the library and information science programs I'd seen. And I was really interested in exploring that more. So that's why I chose library science. And little did I know that I would graduate in the middle of a pandemic. So everything sort of screeched to a halt midway through my program in 2020, and we all had to scramble to figure out what we were going to do. I had originally planned, once I got back into school, I was like, I love academia. I think I want to be a researcher and I want to do that. Then what happened in the pandemic is all the funding for these sort of entry points got cut. So I had to make some quick decisions on how badly do I want this, and do I want to sort of take that financial hit and hope for the best, or do I really need some more financial security right now? And unfortunately for me, like, it turned out I was like, security is more important for my life situation right now. Even though I love academia and I love research, let's just stick with industry because it's what I know. So I had actually been laid off during the pandemic, which was, yet another strike, right? So here's all the things that you could, have a lot of self-doubt about yourself because of, but I kept going. And finally, what got me to where I am today is that I befriended an older woman living in the sort of the middle of nowhere, Washington. And she used to work for Microsoft, and she saw what I could do. She saw my resume and she was just like, I don't know why you're so concerned about breaking into tech. You're already in tech. Like, you can do all of this. You've been doing all of this. And having that validation was really important for me. And I think really propelled me forward to be able to present myself confidently enough that I could get the roles that I was looking for. And so that's how I ended up at Extensis, which is a software company focused on different things to do with fonts. And it's very interesting to me because they were the first company that was excited that I didn't really fit into a box. They were excited that I had these other interests outside of just programming. And a lot of what they do touches on my library science background, even though nothing in the job description would lead you to believe that. But like, all of their work with organizing fonts and pairing fonts, that's all sort of library, that's information science. How do you organize the things, right? How do you find the things? So even though it was like a very doubtful time back when the pandemic hit and I got laid off and I was like, oh gosh, I've made a terrible decision. What am I going to do with my life? It works out. I mean, you can parlay quite a lot, because once you have the experience, that gives you the confidence to keep going forward. And I'd been at this company for a couple months when I was like, you know what, I can tell they're very supportive. They encourage you to try new things. They encourage you to fail. They encourage you to make mistakes. And so I approached my boss and I said, hey, for the past 4 years, I've been trying to go be a developer again, and it just hasn't worked out for me. And I said, I know that we have a whole team, over here that's doing this. Could I shadow one of them? Could I work with them? I'm really interested in eventually moving over here if that's something that the company would support. And that was a big risk for me, because sometimes you do things like that at a company and they go, oh, you're like rocking the boat. We don't know how we feel about you anymore. But if you trust your boss, then you can take some more risks. And he was over the moon about it. He thought it was the greatest idea. They don't have anyone who works my department, which is sort of the systems side of things, in programming. And so it's kind of siloed. The programmers are developing stuff, but they don't fully understand what's coming over from our side. And so he's like, this would be just perfect. It would fix a lot of our problems to have you over there. So that's what I'm currently doing. Is I'm still working as a data analyst, but I'm in transition to the developer section of my company. And so I know we're almost at time. If you take anything out of this, it's okay if your interests don't make sense and don't line up, because if you keep going after them, you will eventually find your niche. Thanks.
Catherine, thank you very much. And high school students, it's now time to enter your questions into the chat. And panelists, feel free to respond to the questions. Even if one panelist has already answered the question, you might have another take on it you'd like to share. So thank you very much. And please remember, high school students, to go ahead and unmute your microphone when you ask your question. I will be calling on whoever puts in the chat first. I will order received is the order served out for the questions. So, and if your camera is on, that's also really helpful. Thank you. Quincy, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, hi. So basically for the past year, I've been in my high school's computer science class. So I've just been learning, I just learned Unity this past year. So I've basically only had experience with video games. And my thing is I'm trying to kind of figure out how I can incorporate my other interests into computer science and in this class, because a lot of other people in my class are mostly interested in video games and I am not. So I guess that's kind of a pretty open question, but if anyone has like any advice for me on how to figure out different pathways for how to incorporate, like I'm super interested in like microbiology and stuff like that. So if any of you have any advice for me.
Yeah, I'll jump in. That's really cool that you're interested in microbiology. Your story resonates with me because I remember in undergrad I took a class where we were using Unity and I was blown away by like, I think it helps sometimes to think of especially technologies like Unity less as like a video game development software and more as like a space in which to showcase your creative ideas and designs. So like there was this one student in my class who was very talented and she would make these like, she would use Unity less as like a game platform and more as like a space to create these like worlds that you could walk through with like a whole bunch of really cool assets and designs. So maybe if you can try and like pivot your experience in this class into like a place to get more familiar with what Unity can allow you to do to express some of your interests, like I think it's actually a really useful tool for doing that.
Thank you for that.
I will add perhaps that you can also really think across disciplines here. We have, for example, a project with molecular computers. And so you can combine microbiology and nanotechnology and neuroscience with computer science. And that's where the really cool stuff happens, right? It's not just about gaming, but right, there's lots of opportunities, I think, if you look a little bit outside of your traditional field. And I certainly have examples of students who, you know, come to my lab with a degree that is not a computer science degree, and they're interested in coding. But the opposite is also true. You can, as a computer scientist, you have a really versatile background that you can apply to lots of different disciplines. Just think outside the box and forget about the gaming part, I guess. If you're not interested in that, that's totally fine.
Yeah, thank you.
And Acacia, could you go ahead and ask your question?
I know a lot of people, especially at the lower levels, kind of just associate like computer science as code as programming. Do you think it's more than that? And how do you think it's different?
At least my volume is low for you, Acacia. You might want to repeat and speak up.
We couldn't really hear you.
So Keisha, I'll go ahead and read your question. And I'm sorry if your typed question in the chat is shorter than your actual. Her question is, do you see computer science as more than just code?
I sure do. I think everyone's nodding. You learn the code, but to build the things, but it's, for me anyway, it's really a way of problem solving. There's sort of a mindset of how do you see this thing that you want to build or this problem you want to solve, and how do you break this down and how do you actually make it happen?
Yes,
Yeah.
I go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, you can equate code to language essentially. So like computer science is more the art, or I guess software engineering to be more specific, is this art of taking this language and saying something meaningful with it. The same way that like a novel is more than just a collection of words and sentences.
Yeah, it's almost a lifestyle, algorithmic thinking or problem solving. That's what it's all about, right? The language is one specific instance of solving a problem. But if you're good at algorithmic thinking, you can optimize your day and you can think about what you can parallelize and how you should schedule your tasks and whatnot, right? I mean, this is like a lot of what you learn as a computer scientist really applies to life in general. And that's why it's such a versatile degree, because you can solve problems for others and optimize them and think in terms of algorithms. And coding is one thing, right? Everybody's focused on coding, but I can tell from my experience, all the languages I've ever learned as part of my education are obsolete now, right? You're going to most likely whatever you learn now is going to be obsolete in a few years. And you have to be that lifelong learner who really quickly learns a new language, a new tool, a new library and whatnot, right? It never ends. The field is moving really, really fast. So whatever you're coding in right now is probably not going to be used for very long. And so again, the foundations are really important there, right? The algorithmic thinking is what stays, not the language you're going to be coding in.
And Isaac, could you share your question, please?
Yeah, so my question is, would you say working in this field is for everyone? Do you have to have like this special interest, or like is it just something that you could just start and be like, okay, this is what I want?
There's so much online that you can really start with the zero knowledge. I think you can go to YouTube, you can work through a tutorial with zero knowledge, and you can build your first machine learning application in a couple of days, I think, without any background, basically. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with the resources on the internet in these days. You don't need a degree for that. That's my take.
Yeah, I don't
Oh.
think you need any. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, you go.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think, there's definitely, I wouldn't say there's any special aptitude. I know that's sort of sometimes an unspoken question, is like, are certain people just better at this? And it's like, sometimes people already think in a way that makes them go faster through computer science courses, but it's because it's a way of thinking, it's something that you can learn no matter where you start from.
Yeah, I agree, where I think, like, reflecting on my own experience, I never thought of myself as a computer scientist. And even once I started at OSU, like, I still had kind of this barrier where, like, oh, I'm just doing this because of my research interests, or like I didn't fit into what I considered to be the mold of who a computer scientist should be. But over time, as it's been, I think, almost exactly a decade now since I started this. It's like, I don't know what else I could call myself at this point. So I think it helps to think of computer science or code or software engineering or whatever you want to call it as like a a tool to use in order to express what you actually want to do. So you don't need to be someone special to be a computer scientist. And as Christoph said, there's a lot of resources online. You can build something in a couple days if that's your end goal, and you don't necessarily need to get your college degree in computer science in order to do that anymore, which is really empowering, honestly.
Thank you. And Ananya, could you read your question, please?
So you guys were mentioning that, like, you guys were mentioning the difference between industry and academia, like going into academics. Like, what are the differences, like, to go into industry, to go into academics, or like just like the lifestyle differences between the two?
I can do industry since that's mostly what I've been in, aside from my brief stint in grad school. I started, so it's really interesting how many subdivisions there are within industry. So I worked in the healthcare industry for about 4 years, but doing tech in the healthcare industry. And the mindset there is very different from the mindset of doing tech in the software industry where I am now. From what I know of academia, I feel like depending on who you work for, there's a lot less room to just sort of do side projects in industry. Like the types of roles that I've had have been very much like, these are our requirements, we need you to build these things for us. You know, and some employers are more open to your suggestions, and some are more just like, this is the contract, here's what you're building. And you're not really going to have any time to explore anything, because that's not what they want. They want a product delivered to them. Whereas there seems, you know, if you can get funding for something to research in academia, you can do pretty much whatever you want, which is pretty cool. And I wouldn't like, I feel like there's probably debates over if certain industries are more secure than others, but I think COVID changed a lot of that. I've seen just as many industry folks get laid off as people in academia, like grad students not being able to get their contracts renewed or get jobs or things like that. So I don't think one is safer than another in terms of job security. It's kind of all up in the air, and it's probably better to follow an interest rather than go for the safe option, because what is safe?
Well, thank you. And Shan, could you read your question, please?
So I kind of have two questions. So my first question is, what was the greatest challenge you faced in your research? And then my other question is, how can we do a better job of sort of translating the ideas that come up in academia into the real world?
Yeah, I guess for biggest challenge, I think my largest challenge was making that switch from undergrad to graduate school, like being faced with having to independently come up with projects that I found to be interesting and figuring out how to complete them. And just generally having this vague idea of like, okay, I want to do research. I'm generally interested in, you know, this field of like HCI meets software engineering. And then translating that into like a specific research question that was actually actionable was rather difficult. So that kind of led to this. And also like COVID happened too, which makes everything more difficult. But just generally coming up with like an actionable research plan is really difficult. And like your advisor, like when you're a PhD student, you generally have a faculty member that you're working directly with, or maybe a couple. So they should be helping with that process. And like my advisor obviously was too. He wasn't like slacking off, but it still is hard to like, especially when you're working on your PhD. It's like 5 to 6 years of just intensely focusing on like one specific interesting problem. And so you can kind of face burnout pretty pretty easily when, you know, that's the only thing you're thinking about every single day, which again is why it's important to like do something that you really care about.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think as a PhD student, you work with a faculty, you're mentored, you still get a lot of help. I found the next phase more challenging when you're supposed to stand on your own legs and nobody is actually going to tell you what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to do it. And you have to figure out sort of these research problems and a plan and write your grant proposals from scratch very often without mentorship, and that is very challenging. But that's also, as was mentioned earlier, that's one of the big advantages of being in academia, because you do have that freedom to do basically what you want, right? You don't have a manager who tells you deliver this in 2 weeks, and you don't like that, doing that sort of thing necessarily, right? In academia, you can really follow your passion. At least that's the idealistic view, right? In reality, there is funding, and funding sort of determines also what you can do, and so there are constraints, obviously, but still, I think you have an enormous amount of freedom, and that comes with a certain cost as well. And I think to your second part of the question, I don't know why you added do a better part or do a better job at translating these things. I think we're doing a pretty good job, right? A lot of the things we're doing research may never actually make it into an application or into something useful. Some of these results are very foundational, and they may have minor impacts on, you know, on the world perhaps, but they're still important. And so I'm not driven by this, right? I don't really care about that so much as maybe others do. I care about the longer term research, deep research questions. And it's not my primary concern that these will have an application in the next 5 years or so. And it's fine. If you're driven by that, then great, right? You can focus on that. But I'm more interested in longer term research, answering longer term research questions. And that's perhaps also the difference. There's, I think, that we haven't really mentioned or talked about. There is industry research, right? That's sort of the overlap between academia and an industry job in the traditional sense, right? Intel has a lot of research teams, for example, where you have to have a PhD. So you're not in academia, you're also not directly reporting to a manager who tells you to do a product, right? They're doing research for the sake of research, for the long-term sustainability of their company and whatnot. So that is probably, if you get a PhD, most likely you will end up in a position like that in industry doing research. The PhD opens a lot of doors, but it also closes many, I keep saying. All right, it's not a universal solution. So you think carefully about before you get a PhD. And it's probably in these days very unlikely that you're going to end up in academia. It's I hate to say that, but it's very tough to get academic positions in these days, and very few get them. So if that's your career path, be ready for a plan B or a plan C. It's just not, statistically speaking, very likely that you're going to be in academia for your life. I don't want to discourage you. I mean, still, if you're really driven by that, then go for it. But have a plan B and a plan C, perhaps.
Thank you. Christy, I see that you have a question.
Hi, so my question is, do you have any advice on where to apply for college for someone who is interested in CS? So I'm personally interested in CS and have many have advised me to do my undergraduate at OSU, which is in state, but I want to go out of state to California because I would think it's like a new start and like it's full of opportunities as well.
That is a great question, and I think it's so hard to advise because life can go so many ways. I did my undergraduate at Oregon State back when the computer science online program was pretty new, so it an adventure in that way, and I did meet people, but it was a very different format, and not one that was conducive to like forming lasting connections with people, because online was still kind of in its early legs there. Something that I wasn't told that I will share was that I was, when I was in high school looking at colleges, the financial impact was never really discussed. It was just sort of go for your dreams and shoot for the moon. And like, yes, if you know what you want to do and you have a direction, absolutely go for it. But for people like me who were a bit unsure and just knew that they wanted an education, I could have saved myself some student debt if I'd have made like a closer to home choice, and that's ultimately what ended up happening for me. I did the community college thing and then I went to a 4-year, but I just think it's something to keep in mind that yes, it's important to meet people and have new experiences and go new places, because you'll learn things about yourself. But at the end of the day, there will be a bill to pay unless you are lucky enough to get scholarships or, other kinds of funding.
Thank you. And Ellie Dean, you have a question.
So you mentioned before how code you've learned often becomes obsolete in a few years. And I was just wondering, how difficult is it to keep up with those changes?
Well, it's difficult, but I think it's not just coding, right? I mean, it's pretty much any job you have in these days requires you to learn lifelong, basically. So coding is just, one example where you have to keep up with new languages. And I think I can rely on my foundations again. That is really important. If you can think algorithmically, you can quickly learn a new language because all the constructs are somewhat similar. It's just the syntax is going to be different and whatnot. But again, it's not just languages, right? There's new things coming up. Machine learning was a thing for many years, then it sort of disappeared, and now it's only exploded. Everybody talks about machine learning. And a lot of students didn't know anything about that. I can tell you, in our department, we canceled the neural networks classes because nobody took them a few years ago. Now they're banging on our doors for having more machine learning classes suddenly, right? And so it's just one of these phenomena. Things come and go, and you constantly have to learn something new. And that's okay. I mean, you just have to get into the business of like carving out some time for these things, and don't think you will be done once you have your degree. That's barely the beginning.
Thank you. And Ellie Sandholm, I see you have a question.
Hi, I was wondering what were like some things you considered when you were looking into like further education or like graduate school after your undergrad, and how you decided whether like you want grad school or not.
Yeah, I think personally for me, since I'd been doing research for, I would say like a pretty long time, or longer than average for probably an undergraduate. Like I had been doing it off and on throughout my whole undergraduate career, plus like the ASE internship was pretty research oriented. So it was something that I was comfortable with and familiar with. And I personally also already had a connection at the university that I was mostly targeting, which I'm saying all this to say, like, I don't know how generalizable my case was necessarily, but more broadly speaking, I think research spoke to me because of the things that we keep bringing up. Like, you have a lot more flexibility than you might have in other situations. I was interested in the long-term positions that a master's or PhD degree would allow me to get. So academia, research positions in labs, or in industry at like big companies. And when I compared that to what I would be able to get with my undergraduate degree, which would most likely be like a software engineering or like a UX researcher design position, since my degree was kind of in that space as well. I just found those options to be like obviously compelling, but I was less excited about them, I guess. And so ultimately just the like long-term investment of a PhD seemed like it would lead me more to the kinds of positions that I was actually really excited about in the end. So I think like, I guess that's maybe the main takeaway is like, if you think research is really, really cool and you really enjoy doing it, then like keep on going.
It's an
Something-
investment into your future.
Yes. Something that we did when I went to grad school that was incredibly helpful, and I wish we'd done in undergrad, was they had us look up a bunch of job descriptions for different job titles that we were interested in, or like fields we were interested in, and had us look at the requirements for those. And if you're prone to imposter syndrome, it will freak you out, because you're going to be like, there is no way I could have 10 years of experience with this, you know, when I'm just in school. But what it does kind of, you start to see patterns. You start to see, oh, sometimes you need a master's for this, but sometimes you can get by with a bachelor's in experience, or sometimes you can, like, you know, even just a high school diploma, you can code if you have like the, or if you can build a portfolio that shows you know what you're talking about. Sometimes you can get in that way. So if you're looking at further education, I think it's very important to look at where you would be going employment wise afterwards, not because like the job is all there is in the world, but you know, financial security is a thing, and it can help you calculate like, okay, if I get into debt for school, can I pay it off in any kind of timely fashion, or is this just going to dig me a bigger hole?
Thank you. And we have roughly 3 minutes remaining. So I don't know that we'll get to all the questions, but Naomi, I see that you have a question and you're up next.
Yeah, I was wondering if it matters, like if you major, what you major in, I guess, in your undergraduate, if it's computer science, electrical engineering, applied math, or math, and like how that impacts your ability to get a software engineering job, just because, or like, and then also like how much of the work is learned on the job. Yeah.
It probably varies by industry. You know, academia is probably much different. There's probably a lot more mentoring that goes on. In my experience, and I hate to say this, like it really depends on the company that you're looking at. Some companies will recruit people right out of school, Google, Microsoft, you know, all the big names. They will recruit and train people. A lot of other companies tend to fall into that kind of internet meme. I don't know if you've seen it, where it's like, okay, you know, you're 20 years old and we want you to have 21 years of experience before we'll even look at you. But what I've found, like, it can be really overwhelming to look at all the languages that companies want you to know, or, you know, look at all the different like paradigms that they want you to understand. A lot of times these job descriptions aren't always written by the person who's hiring you. It's like written by human resources. And so they kind of grab a bunch of buzzwords to make a position that will hopefully attract like the candidates they're looking for. But if you can if you can represent yourself well enough to get into an interview with the actual hiring manager, then if you have math, if you have computer science, if you have engineering, it doesn't really matter as much. What matters is being able to have a conversation with them and explain what it is that you know, and for them to see that like you're flexible and that you can learn, you know, what they have, that you have an enthusiasm for picking up things that you don't know. Because most people are realistic enough, most hiring managers, to realize that like if you're coming right out of school, you're not gonna have all of this stuff. And so if they're willing to interview you, that means they're willing to hire and train you. They just have to decide that they want to go on that journey with you. And part of that is being able to speak, and to speak confidently, which is very difficult sometimes, you know, to speak and go, I may not know everything, but here's my passion and I really want to do this.
And show your work. A lot of companies want to see your actual work. Have your
Yes.
GitHub and make it public and show your projects in a GitHub that has been active for the last 10 years or so. You know, that's a great credential to have.
Yes.
Maybe worth more than a degree in some cases.
Well, I wish we had time for the remaining questions because I've learned a lot from listening to our panelists. Thank you very much, Christoph, Amber, and Catherine for joining us today. And ACE interns, thank you for participating and for your wonderful questions. And we'll be returning in about 0 seconds to the main meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.